The morning began with a silence that was never to be trusted in a war zone, for silence often came before the storm. And she knew this better than anyone else, for she had marched through valleys where echoes of gunfire seemed to sleep, only to wake without warning. She adjusted her helmet, the strap cutting lightly against her jaw, and tried to steady her breathing. The desert sun had not yet reached its peak, but its heat was already clawing at her throat. She was leading her squad along a dirt path, narrow and broken, carved by years of forgotten footsteps and the tracks of heavy wheels that had long rusted away. She was not afraid of the mission, for fear had left her the first day she saw her friends carried away in silence, but she was cautious as any soldier must be. Her eyes scanned the ridges above the road, searching for the glint of glass or the shadow of a rifle. Her boots pressed down carefully step after step, the rhythm of the squad, a heartbeat behind her each. Man trusting her instincts more than they trusted their own, and that weight was heavier than the rifle slung over her shoulder. Still, she carried it without complaint, because leadership was not something asked for. It was something that demanded blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Every mission carried an air of uncertainty, and this one was no different. They were tasked to clear a route for the convoy that would follow, carrying supplies. Food and medicine, 40 lives depending on them. And she repeated that number in her head as if it were a prayer. 40 lives, 40 reasons not to fail. The terrain around them was deceptively calm dust, rising with every movement. Small stones cracking beneath their weight, the kind of sound that felt louder than thunder. When nerves were stretched thin, she clenched her jaw, ignoring the sweat dripping into her eyes, and thought only of those who were counting on them. It happened faster than the blink of an eye. A roar splitting the air, tearing away the calm. And replacing it with chaos, her body was lifted, then thrown as though by the hand of an invisible giant. Dust and fire filling the sky, she hit the ground hard, her ears ringing her mind, refusing to believe what had just occurred. The first thought was for her squad, but the second thought was for her own body. A strange numbness crawling up her legs and settling in her chest. She tried to move, but the ground felt glued to her skin, and when she finally forced her eyes downward, she saw what she feared. Her legs were broken, twisted in ways no human body should endure. Blood seeping fast into the soil, turning the dust dark red. Her breath came shallow as panic tried to seize her throat, but she fought it back with every ounce of will because panic was death in this place. The explosion had ripped apart not just her flesh but the very rhythm of the mission. She could not hear her men. She could not tell if they were alive or gone. She could only hear the faint ringing in her ears like church bells muffled by storm clouds. Her hands clawed at the dirt as she pulled herself forward, refusing to surrender to the weight of agony. She knew she was far from safety. She knew the blast was only the beginning, and somewhere out there, eyes were watching. The ambush was not finished yet. The enemy waited, hidden, silent, patient, and she was now a soldier, without legs, crawling in the open across ground that could be her grave. Her rifle lay a few feet away, unreachable for the moment, her hands slick with blood as she tried to dig her elbows into the soil and drag herself forward inch by inch, every breath cutting like glass inside her chest. Yet she moved because stopping was not an option. Not when lives still depended on her deed. Desert stretched ahead like a cruel test, mocking her weakness, daring her to keep going or to fade into the dust. She bit down hard on the pain, her teeth grinding against one another. Her vision blurred, but her mind sharpened with a single thought. She had to reach the radio. She had to call for the strike. She had to finish the mission, no matter the cost. Her body was broken, but her spirit refused to break. Her hands dug deeper, leaving trails of blood behind her, and as she pulled herself another meter across the burning ground, she realized something terrifying waited in the silence just beyond her hearing. Her hands trembled against the ground, but she forced them to hold steady because the dirt beneath her was the only thing keeping her alive. Her arms became her legs, her muscles burning with every drag forward. She felt the sting of rocks tearing at her skin, and yet she welcomed the pain, for pain meant she was still alive. The ringing in her ears faded enough for other sounds, to bleed through faint cries, the groan of metal, the hiss of fire from the wreckage behind her. The blast had claimed her squad, but she could not look back, not yet, because looking back might break her. The air was heavy with dust. It clung to her. Throat turned her coughs into rattles that threatened to tear her chest apart. Each breath felt stolen, but still she took them. She pressed her elbows deep into the soil, pulled her body forward inch by inch, her heart counting each movement like the ticking of a clock every second, carrying her closer to life or closer to death. She did not know which, but she kept moving, because to stop was to let the desert claim her. Her uniform was soaked in blood, her vision swimming, but her mind clung to the single mission that still remained. She thought of the radio. It was no longer strapped to her back. The explosion had flung it somewhere into the chaos ahead. She pictured it lying half buried under dust, the one lifeline to summon the strike. That could save 40 men waiting in the convoy behind her. She did not know if the convoy was still advancing or if they had been warned, but she did know that without her voice, without her call, they would ride straight into death. She pressed, her body forward again, the ground scraping against her wounds, her lips cracked from the heat, yet she whispered the number 40 again and again, as if that chant would carry her further. The sun crept higher, turning the desert into a furnace. The heat burned against her helmet, scorched her skin. Every shadow vanished until only blinding light remained. She narrowed her eyes against the glare, searching the ground ahead, desperate for a glint of metal that could be the radio. Her hands shook as she dragged herself further, and she bit back the scream that threatened to escape her throat, because a scream would give her position away, and she knew the enemy was still near, watching, waiting. The silence was too perfect, too deliberate. Every soldier learned to fear the silence as much as the bullets. A faint crack broke the stillness, the sharp report of a rifle in the distance. She froze, her cheek pressed against the dirt, her pulse racing in her ears. Another crack followed, and a spray of sand leapt inches from her arm. The sniper had found her. The desert itself seemed to tighten around her chest as she forced her body to remain still. She could not rise. She could not run. She could only crawl, and crawling made her the perfect target. She pressed her face deeper into the dirt, tasting the bitterness of sand and blood, as she prayed the next shot would not end her struggle. The silence returned, but it was heavier now, like a hand pressing against her skull. She knew the sniper was adjusting, waiting for her to move again. She shut her eyes, gathering strength, summoning every ounce of control, not to tremble, not to let her body betray her position. The desert wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and iron. She heard faint footsteps, then nothing. Again, her arms trembled as she braced herself to move, her mind calculating the distance she had covered and the distance still ahead. The radio had to be close. It had to be within reach or everything was lost. She drew in a shallow breath, then dragged herself forward again. The movement, small, deliberate, yet it sent a new wave of agony ripping through her broken body. She clenched her jaw against it, the sound of her own bones grinding together almost louder than the shots she feared would come. She kept moving, half expecting the sniper to fire again, but the desert stayed eerily quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. Her hand reached forward, clawing at the dirt until her fingers scraped something. Hard and unyielding, buried beneath the dust, she froze, her chest rising and falling, her heart pounding because what she felt might be her salvation, or it might be the trigger of another trap. Her fingers closed tighter around the hard edge beneath the sand, and her breath caught in her throat. She scraped away the dirt, slowly afraid of what might lie hidden. Her nails broke against the gravel, her palms raw with blood, but at last the shape revealed itself, and relief surged through her chest. It was the radio, scarred and cracked from the blast, yet still whole. She pulled it close to her body, holding it as if it were more precious than life itself, because in truth it was her only chance of keeping life within reach for herself and for the convoy still waiting behind. She tried to lift the handset, but her arms shook violently. The weight of the device, magnified by the exhaustion that dragged at her every movement, she pressed the button. Nothing came. The silence mocked her. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She pressed again. Still nothing. Her throat tightened. Despair creeping into the edges of her mind, but she crushed it down with the same will that had carried her through every step since the blast. She remembered the training, the drills, the countless nights of repeating procedure until it lived inside her like instinct. She adjusted the frequency, her hands slick with blood and trembling like leaves. In the wind static, cracked faint and uneven, but it was sound. It was hope. She pressed the button again, forcing her voice into the receiver. Her throat-dry words breaking apart, yet determined to push through. She spoke the call sign, she gave the coordinates. She begged for the strike that would tear the enemy from the ridges and save the convoy. She waited, pressing the receiver hard against her ear, but only static replied. The emptiness was louder than any explosion. Her chest heaved with anger and pain, but she refused to accept silence. She would not allow the desert to swallow her voice. She shifted her position, dragging her ruined body into a shallow depression in the ground to shield herself from the sniper above. She tried again this time, louder, her voice cracked raw with desperation. She called once more, sending her words into the void. The static broke, then returned, then broke again like a whisper caught in the wind. She slammed the button once more, sweat and blood mixing on her. Skin, her vision blurred, and she blinked furiously to clear it. Her lips trembled, yet she spoke again and again until her voice was no more than a rasp. A faint voice answered through the static, the sound so fragile she feared it might vanish if she breathed too hard. It was the operator acknowledging her call. The voice asked for confirmation, but her throat gave nothing more than a whisper. She pressed the receiver close to her mouth, forcing every drop of strength into one final reply. She repeated the coordinates, her words jagged, torn by pain, but carried with iron will. The line went dead again, then returned with confirmation the strike was on its way. Her heart leapt, but only for a moment because she knew the enemy had heard. The same static, and they would not let her live long enough to see the sky light up. Her eyes scanned the ridge. Though her vision swam, she saw movement, shadows darting along the rocks. The enemy was closing in. The sniper had given away her position by firing earlier, and now they would come to finish what the blast had started. She dragged herself deeper into the shallow ground, her arms screaming with exhaustion, but her spirit demanding more. Her fingers curled around the dirt as if clinging to the earth itself could anchor her against the tide of pain. She could hear footsteps now clearer, louder, pressing against the stones above her, the enemy descending like hunters drawn by the scent of blood. The seconds stretched into eternity, each heartbeat pounding like a drum inside her skull. The radio lay heavy against her chest, the static still alive in her ear. The promise of destruction moving toward the enemy lines, but not yet here, not yet in time. She counted the footsteps, 1, 2, 3, maybe more. Her bloodied hand reached for the rifle that still lay just beyond her reach. The sniper had not fired again, which meant they were waiting for a cleaner shot, or perhaps moving closer for the kill. Her arm stretched her fingers, trembling just inches from the weapon, but her strength faltered and she felt the shadow of movement fall across her. The shadow loomed larger as her fingers brushed the cold metal of her rifle. Her lungs burned her throat dry as stone. She clutched at the weapon, dragging it closer, the weight dragging against the dirt as though it belonged to the desert. Not to her. Her arm shook. Her vision wavered, yet she pulled it into her grasp. The familiar feel of steel against her palm sparking life. Within her veins, her body broken, but her resolve sharpening like a blade, she pressed the butt of the rifle against her shoulder, though her shattered legs screamed against the motion. The footsteps grew clearer. She could hear the crunch of boots. Against rock, the scrape of loose stones tumbling down the ridge. They were too close, the air seemed to thicken. Every sound, magnified, the click of her rifle's safety echoing like thunder. She slowed her breathing, her cheek pressed to the dirt, her eyes straining down the sights waiting for the figure to break the horizon. Her finger tightened around the trigger, though every muscle begged for rest. She did not rest. She did not break. She would never surrender her mission. A shape emerged, jagged against the glare of the sun. Her pulse surged. She fired the recoil, crashing into her broken body, forcing a gasp from her chest. The shot tore through the silence, sending the enemy scattering cries rang out from the ridge. The footsteps multiplied. But she had bought herself a moment, one precious heartbeat of time. She dragged herself deeper into cover, her rifle heavy yet alive in her hands. She counted. Her breaths counted the shadows shifting above her. She knew they would flank her. She knew they would not stop until she was silent. The radio crackled against her chest, a faint voice breaking through the chaos, the strike inbound minutes away. Hold position. Hold position. The words rattled in her skull, both salvation and torment. Minutes. Might as well be years when death closed in. She swallowed hard, tasting blood on her lips. She would hold because she had no other choice. Her arms screamed, her skin burned. Yet she raised her rifle again, scanning the ridge for the next shadow that dared to move against her. Bullets rained down, stones splintering around her shards, slicing her face. But she held steady. She fired again, the crack of her weapon, rolling like thunder across the valley. She saw a figure fall another dart back into cover, but they were many, and she was one. Her magazine dwindled her strength with it. Yet she smiled through the pain, because every shot, every second bought, was another step closer to the fire that would soon rain from the sky. Her mind drifted too. The convoy, the men who had no idea how close death waited for them. She pictured their faces, the ones who trusted her, the ones who marched behind her, and she whispered their number again. 40 lives. 40 reasons to fight until nothing remained of her body, but dust and blood. Her vision blurred, tears or sweat. She could not tell. She blinked it away, pressing the rifle tight and firing once more. The recoil tearing through her broken frame, but her will unbroken. The footsteps grew louder. They were moving closer, no longer content to wait. They wanted her finished before the strike could arrive. She braced herself, her hands slippery with blood gripping the rifle tighter, her chest heaving, each breath shallow. The sun burned above her, the ground soaked beneath her. The radio crackled again louder, clearer, strike approaching, hold, steady, but she could hear them now, voices low, weapons clattering as they drew nearer to her shallow cover. Her heart thundered louder than the desert itself. She tightened her grip, ready for the moment when shadow and fire would collide. And then through the blinding light, she saw them, figures emerging from the ridge. Their weapons raised, their eyes fixed on her. The desert seemed to hold its breath as she pressed her cheek tighter to the rifle stock, her finger curling against the trigger, her body trembling but her spirit steel as she aimed at the first figure stepping into her line of fire. The first figure filled her sight, the sun behind him turning his outline into fire. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked and the man fell heavy into the dust, his body twisting as the others shouted and broke into motion. She shifted her aim, her body screaming in protest, but her will pulling her arms steady. She fired again, the recoil hammering her bones. Another enemy stumbled, clutching his chest, but more came, shadows leaping from rock to rock, rifles flashing, bursts of fire cutting the air above her head. She dragged herself deeper into the shallow earth, pressing flat against the dirt as bullets ripped across the ridge sparks, showering stone fragments biting into her arms. She gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out her hand. Reloaded the rifle with a trembling, practiced motion, each second feeling like eternity, her mind whispering that she had to hold, that she could not let go, that the strike was close, now closer than ever. She lifted the rifle again, breath ragged. Vision blurred and found another target. The crack echoed again. A body tumbled from the rocks, but still they pressed closer, their voices rising harsh like wolves circling prey. She could almost feel their breath. She fired again and again each shot, buying a heartbeat of time, her magazine running thin, her arms heavy, her hands slick, her body screaming to stop. But she never stopped. She would not stop. Her lips moved silently, repeating the number that had carried her through the dust and fire. 40 lives, 40 lives, 40 lives! The radio pressed against her chest crackled louder through the static. The voice returning sharp and urgent: strike incoming, 30 seconds, hold position, 30 seconds. It might have been an hour. It might have been a lifetime. She clenched the rifle against her shoulder, her finger raw against the trigger as she counted down in her head each second, marked by the sound of boots scraping stone above her. They were nearly upon her. She could hear their shouts, feel their steps, the air thick with the storm about to break. She turned her rifle toward the ridge and fired again. Sparks leapt from rock as bullets answered from above, dirt exploding around her face. Stones cutting her cheek, blood running in two. Her eyes. She wiped it with the back of her hand, refusing to blink, refusing to surrender. The rifle bucked again. Another shadow crumpled. But still they came. Her magazine clattered empty. She fumbled with another, the movement slow, her strength fading. Her breath rattling, but she managed the reload, slamming the bolt home just as a figure vaulted down the ridge, rushing straight at her. Her rifle rose, her finger squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out. The man collapsed yards from her body, falling. Still in the dust, but another followed, and another. They swarmed, now desperate to finish her before the strike arrived. Her heart hammered her throat tight, but she fired again, dropping another each movement, tearing at her broken body. But she would not let them pass. She would be the wall, the last breath, the last bullet. If that was what the mission demanded, she whispered the number again. 40 lives, 40 reasons, 40 last chances. The radio screamed in her ear: strike inbound, strike inbound. Clear the area. Clear the area. But she had no strength to clear, no legs to run. She pressed her back to the earth, eyes fixed on the ridge above. Waiting for the sky to break open, she gripped the rifle tighter, knowing she would not be able to move. When the fire fell, she knew she might vanish with the enemy swallowed whole by the strike. Yet she welcomed it because her death would mean their survival, and her survival was never the point, only theirs. The air shifted, a deep roar rising from the horizon, the sound rolling like thunder across the desert. Her enemies' faltered heads lifting as the sky darkened with the promise of steel and fire. She smiled through cracked lips, blood on her teeth, her arms trembling as she raised the rifle. For one final shot before the heavens opened above them, she aimed at the shadow that stood tallest among them and pulled the trigger. And as the bullet left her rifle, the roar of the sky swallowed all sound, and the ground beneath her began to tremble, with the force of the storm descending upon the ridge. The ground shook beneath her broken body as the roar from the sky split. The heavens wide open, fire poured down upon the ridge in a torrent that turned stone to dust and flesh to shadow. The air burst with heat and thunder, each blast hammering her chest as if the desert itself had come alive. Her enemies screamed, their voices lost in the storm, their rifles falling silent one by one as the fire consumed them. She pressed herself flat against the earth, her arms wrapped tight around the radio, her rifle clutched to her chest, the world above her dissolving into flame. The blasts came in waves, each strike closer, louder, brighter. The light seared her eyes though she squeezed them. Shut the shock waves rattled her bones, pressed her deeper into the dirt. Her ears filled with the roar until she could hear nothing else. She thought of the convoy somewhere behind her, shielded by distance, waiting for a signal that the road was clear. She thought of their faces unseen but known their trust in her, their lives balanced on the line. She thought of how close they had come to the same fire that now tore apart. The enemy dust rained down, choking her lungs. The heat clung to her, skin like burning cloth. Her chest rose and fell ragged, each breath fought for as if the air itself resisted her. She opened her eyes, blinking through the haze shapes twisted in the smoke. Enemy bodies scattered across the rocks, motionless or burning. The ridge that had once held death above her, now broken and silent, the strike had torn it clean apart, leaving only ruin. She lay still, her heart pounding but alive, her hands shaking yet still gripping the radio as if afraid it too would vanish. Silence that followed was heavier than the blast itself, the desert holding its breath as the dust slowly settled. She raised her head, her neck stiff, her eyes scanning the devastation, each movement a lance of pain shooting through her shattered body, but she had to see. She had to be certain the ridge was empty, the threat destroyed. She forced herself onto her elbows, dragging her torso higher, though her legs remained limp, dead weight trailing behind her. She lifted the radio, pressing the button with trembling fingers, her voice barely a whisper, but enough to confirm mission. Complete static answered. Then a voice clear and steady. "You did it, hold on. We are coming for you." Relief surged through her chest. But it was fleeting her vision, blurred the edges of the world, dimming her strength, draining fast. She pressed the radio tight against her chest, her head sinking back into the dirt. The battle was done, but her body was breaking piece by piece. She fought to keep her eyes open, to stay awake because sleep now meant never waking again. She thought of the men in the convoy. She thought of the lives saved. She thought of the number that had carried her through the crawl 40. Her body shook with tremors, her hands slipping. On the radio, her lips dry, her throat raw. Yet she smiled faintly at the thought of their survival. Even if hers was uncertain, she had done it. She had held the line. She had called the strike. She had given them the chance to live the sound of rotors. Reached her faint at first, then louder. The chop of blades cutting the heavy air. She turned her head slowly, eyes straining to catch the shadow in the sky. A helicopter approaching, slicing through the dust. Her chest rose shallow, her strength fading, fast. But she forced her arm upward, her bloodied hand stretching into the light. A signal to the sky above her vision blurred. The helicopter loomed larger, its shadow sweeping across her broken form. She heard the shouts of her comrades, the pounding of boots drawing nearer. But her ears rang with emptiness, her body sinking deeper into the earth, her eyelids heavy. She tried to whisper the number. One last time, but her voice broke into silence. The dust swirled around her, the world fading at the edges, her hand still raised toward the sky as the shadow closed in, and the desert held her in its grip, leaving the question hanging in the air whether she would rise again with those she had saved or vanish into the silence of the sands forever.